you should care for me. Awful nights, paradise is what I long to see. You made my life so glamorous. You can't blame me for feeling amorous. Oh, it's wonderful, marvelous. That you should care for, that you should care for, that you should care for me.
Hello, bros. We're back with Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. My little friend. My little friend, buddy. The little friend. We resume on page 93, chapter 2. Let's turn on the light. There we go. There we go. She got on her bicycle and rode over to the country club. The office was locked. Everybody was at lunch in the dining room. She walked down the hall to the pro shop, where she found Healy's big brother Pemberton smoking a cigarette behind the counter and reading a stereo magazine. "Can I give this money to you?" she asked him. She liked Pemberton. He was Robin's age and had been Robin's friend. Now he was 21, and some people said it was the shame that his mother had talked his father out of sending him to military school, back when it might have made a difference. Though Pem had been popular in high school and his picture was on practically every page of his senior class yearbook, he was a loafer and a little bit of a beatnik, and he hadn't lasted long at Vanderbilt or at Ole Miss or even Delta State. Now he lived at home. His hair was a lot longer even than Healy's. In the summer, he was a lifeguard at the country club, and in the winter, all he did was work on his car and listen to loud music. "Hey, Harriet," said Pemberton. He was probably lonesome, Harriet thought, there all by himself in the pro shop. He wore a torn t-shirt, Madras plain shorts, and golf shoes with no socks. The remains of a hamburger and French fries on one of the country club's monogrammed dishes were near his elbow on the counter. "Come over here and help me pick out a car stereo. I don't know anything about car stereos. I want to leave this check with you." Pem hooked his hair behind his ears with a big knuckled hand, then took the check and examined it. He was long-boned, easy in his demeanor, and much taller than Healy. His hair was the same tangled, stripy blonde, light on top and darker underneath. His features were like Healy's too, but more finely cut, and his teeth were slightly crooked, but in a way that was somehow more pleasing than if they were straight. "Well, you can leave it with me," he said at last, "but I'm not sure what to do with it. Say, I didn't know your dad was in town." "He's not." Pemberton, cocking a sly eyebrow at her, indicated the date. "He sent it in the mail," said Harriet. "Where is old Dix anyway? I haven't seen him around in ages." Harriet shrugged. Though she didn't like her father, she knew she wasn't supposed to gossip or complain about him either. "Well, when you see him, why don't you ask him if he'll send me a check too? I really want these speakers." He pushed the magazine across the counter and showed them to her. Harriet studied them. They all looked the same. "No way, sweetie. These blau punks are the sexiest thing around. See? All black with black buttons on the receiver. See how little it is compared to the Pioneers? Well, get that one then." "I will, when you get your dad to send me $300. He took a last drag of his cigarette and stubbed it out on his plate with a hiss. "Say, where's that dingbat brother of mine?" "I don't know." Pemberton leaned forward with a confidential shift of the shoulders. "How come you let him hang around with you?" Harriet stared at the ruins of Pem's lunch, cold French fries, cigarette crooked and hissing in a puddle of ketchup. "Doesn't he get on your nerves?" Pemberton said. "How come you make him dress up like a woman?" Harriet looked up, startled. "You know, in Martha's housecoats." Martha was Pem and Healy's mother. "He loves it. Every time I see him, he's running out of the house with some kind of weird pillowcase or towel over his head or something. He says you make him do it." "No, I don't." "Come on, Harriet." He pronounced her name as if he found something faintly ridiculous about it. I drive by your house and you've always got about 7 or 8 little boys in bed sheets hanging around out in your yard. Ricky Ashmore calls you all the baby Ku Klux Klan, but I think you just enjoy making them dress up like girls. It's a game, said Harriet stolidly. She was annoyed at his persistence. The Bible pageants were a thing of the past. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about my brother. Now it was Pemberton's turn to be uncomfortable. He picked up the stereo magazine and began to leaf through it with studied care. Do you know who killed him? Well, said Pemberton slyly. He put down the stereo magazine. I'll tell you something if you promise not to tell a soul. You know old Mrs. Fountain that lives next door to you? Harriet was looking at him with such undisguised contempt that he collapsed in laughter. What, he said, you don't believe it about Mrs. Fountain and all them people buried up under her house? Several years ago, Pem had scared Healy stiff by telling him somebody had found human bones poking out of Mrs. Fountain's flower bed. Also that Mrs. Fountain had stuffed her dead husband and propped him up in a recliner to keep her company at night. So you don't know who did it then? Nope, said Pemberton a bit curtly. He still remembered his mother coming up to his bedroom. He had been putting together a model airplane, weird, the things that stuck in your mind sometimes, and calling him out into the hall to tell him Robin was dead. It was the only time he'd ever seen her cry. Pem hadn't cried. He was 9 years old, didn't have a clue. He'd just gone back to his room and shut the door, and under a cloud of growing unease, continued work on the Sopwith camel. And he could still remember how the glue beat it up in the seams. It looked like shit. Eventually, he'd thrown it away without finishing it. You shouldn't joke around about this kind of stuff, he said to Harriet. I am not joking. I am in deadly earnest. I am in deadly earnest, said Harriet loftily. Not for the first time. Pemberton thought how different she was from Robin. So different you could hardly believe they were related. Maybe it was partly the dark hair that made her seem so serious, but unlike Robin, she had a ponderous quality about her, poker-faced and pompous, never laughing. There was a whimsical flutter of Robin's ghost about Allison, who now she was in high school, was starting to get a nice little walk on her. She had turned Pem's head on the street the other day without his realizing who she was. But Harriet was not sweet or whimsical by any stretch of the imagination. Harriet was a trip. Yeah, Baba, I think you've been reading too much Nancy Drew, sweetie, he said to her. All that stuff happened before Healy was even born. He practiced the golf swing with an invisible club. There used to be 3 or 4 trains that stopped here every day, and you had a lot more tramps over around the railroad tracks. Maybe whoever did it is still around. If that's true, why haven't they caught him? Did anything seem odd before it happened? Pem snorted derisively. What, you mean like spooky? No, just strange. All right, we can't turn the page for some reason. Look, this wasn't like in the movies. Nobody saw some big pervert or creep hanging around and just forgot to mention it. He sighed. At school for years afterward, the favorite game at recess was to reenact Robin's murder, a game which, passed down and mutated over the years, was still popular at the elementary school. But in the playground version, the killer was caught and punished. Children gathered in a circle by the swing set, raining death blows upon the invisible villain who lay prostrate in their midst. For a while there, he said aloud, some kind of cop or preacher came to talk to us every day. Kids at school used to brag about knowing who did it, or even that they did it themselves just to get attention. Harriet was gazing at him intently. Kids do that. Danny Ratliff, geez, he used to brag all the time about stuff he never did, like shooting people in the kneecaps and throwing rattlesnakes in old ladies' cars. You wouldn't believe some of the crazy stuff I've heard him say at the pool hall. Pemberton paused. He had known Danny Ratliff since childhood, weak and swaggering, throwing his arms around, full of empty boasts and threats. But though the picture was clear enough in his own mind, he wasn't sure how to convey it to Harriet. Danny's just nuts, he said. Where can I find this, Danny? Whoa, you don't want to mess around with Danny Ratliff. He just got out of prison. What for? knife fight or something. Can't remember. Every single one of the Ratliffs has been in the penitentiary for armed robbery or killing somebody except the baby, the little retarded guy. And Healy told me he beat the shit out of Mr. Dial the other day. Harriet was appalled. That's not true. Curtis didn't lay a finger on him. Pemberton chortled. I'm sorry to hear that. I never saw anybody needed to get the shit beat out of them as bad as Mr. Dial. You never did tell me where I can find this Danny. Pemberton sighed. Look, Harriet, he said, Danny Ratliff is like my age. All that with Robin happened back when we were in the 4th grade. Maybe it was a kid who did it. Maybe that's how come they never caught him. Look, I don't see why you think you're such a genius figuring this out when nobody else could. You say he goes to the pool hall? Yes, and the Black Door Tavern. But I'm telling you, Harriet, he didn't have anything to do with it. And even if he did, you better leave him alone. There's a bunch of those brothers, and they're all kind of crazy. Crazy? Not like that. I mean, one of them is a preacher. You've probably seen him. He stands around on the highway yelling about the atonement and shit. And the big brother, Farish, was in the mental hospital down at Whitfield for a while. What for? Because he got hit in the head with a shovel or something. I can't remember. Every single one of them is getting arrested all the time for stealing cars, he added, when he saw how Harriet was looking at him. Breaking in the house is nothing like what you're talking about. If they had anything to do with Robin, the cops would have beat it out of them years ago. He picked up Harriet's check, which was still lying on the counter. All right, kiddo, this is for you and Allison, too. Yes. Where is she? At home. What's she doing? Pem said, leaning forward on his elbows. Watching dark shadows. Reckon she'll be coming to the pool any this summer? If she wants to. Does she have a boyfriend? Boys call her on the phone. Oh, yeah, said Pemberton. Like who? She doesn't like to talk to them. Why is that? Don't know. Reckon if I called her sometime, she'd talk to me? Abruptly, Harriet said, guess what I'm going to do this summer? Huh? I'm going to swim the length of the pool underwater. Pemberton, who was growing a little tired of her, rolled his eyes. What's next? He said. Cover of Rolling Stone. Is this chat even still on? I don't think it is, buddy. I think we got cut off. Oh, there it is, the gaming world. I know I can do it. I held my breath for almost 2 minutes last night. Forget it, sweetie, said Pemberton, who did not believe a word of this. You'll drown. I'll have to fish you out of the pool. Harriet spent the afternoon reading on the front porch. Ida was washing clothes, as she always did on Monday afternoons. Her mother and sister were asleep. She was nearing the end of King Solomon's Mines when Allison, barefoot and yawning, tottered outside in a flowery dress that looked like it belonged to their mother. With a sigh, she lay down on the pillowed porch swing and pushed herself with the tip of her big toe to set herself rocking. Immediately, Harriet put down the book and went to sit by her sister. Did you have any dreams during your nap? She asked. I don't remember. If you don't remember, then maybe you did. Allison didn't answer. Harriet counted to 15 and then more slowly this time, politely repeated what she had just said. I didn't have any dreams. I thought you said you didn't remember. I don't. Hey, said a nasal little voice bravely from the sidewalk. Allison raised herself up on her elbows. Harriet, extremely annoyed at the interruption, turned and saw LaSharon Odom, the grimy little girl whom Mrs. Fawcett had pointed out earlier at the library. She was gripping the wrist of a little white-haired creature of indeterminate sex in a stained shirt that did not quite cover its stomach, and a baby in plastic diapers was straddled on her opposite hip. Like little wild animals afraid to come too close, they stood back and watched with flat eyes that glowed eerie and silvery in the sun in their sunburnt faces. Well, hello there, said Allison, standing up and moving cautiously down the steps to greet them. Shy as Allison was, she liked children, white or black, and the smaller the better. Often she struck up conversations with the dirty ragamuffins who wandered up from the shacks by the river, though Ida Rue had forbidden her to do this. You not going to think they so cute when you come down with the lice or the ringworm, she said. The children watched Allison warily, but stood their ground as she approached. Allison stroked the baby's head. What's his name? She said. LaSharon Odom did not answer. She was looking past Allison at Harriet. Young as she was, there was something pinched and old about her face. Her eyes were a ringing, primitive ice gray, like a wolf cub's. "I seen you at the library," she said. Harriet, stony-faced, met her gaze but did not reply. She was uninterested in babies and small children, and agreed with Ida that they had no business venturing up, uninvited, into the yard. "My name is Allison," Allison said to her. "What's yours?" LaSharon fidgeted. "Are these your brothers? What are their names?" She said, squatting on her heels to look into the face of the smaller child, who was holding a library book by its back cover so that the open pages dragged on the sidewalk. "Will you tell me what your name is?" "Go on, Randy," said the girl, prodding the toddler. "Randy? Is that your name?" "Say yes, I'm Randy." She jostled the baby on her hip. "Say that there's Randy and I'm Rusty," she said, speaking for the baby in a high-pitched, acidic little voice. Randy and Rusty, nasty and dirty, more like it, thought Harriet. With scarcely concealed impatience, she sat on the swing, tapping her foot, as Allison patiently coaxed out all their ages out of LaSharon and complimented her for being such a good babysitter. "And will you let me see your library book?" Allison was saying to the little boy called Randy. She reached for it, but coyly he turned himself away from her, with his whole body grinning infuriatingly. "It ain't his'n," said LaSharon. Her voice, though sharp and richly nasal, was also dainty and clear. "It's mine." "What's it about?" "Ferdinand the Bull." "I remember Ferdinand. He was the little fellow who liked to smell flowers instead of fight, wasn't he?" "You're pretty, lady," burst out Randy, who until the moment had said nothing. Excitedly, he swung his arm back and forth so the pages of the open book scrubbed against the sidewalk. "Is that the right way to treat library books?" said Allison. Randy, flustered, let the book drop altogether. "You picked that up," said his big sister, making as if to slap him. Randy flinched easily from the slap, and, aware that Allison's eyes were on him, stepped backwards and began instead to swivel his lower body in an oddly lascivious and adult-looking little dance. Little creeper. "Why don't her say nothing?" said LaSharon, squinting past Allison at Harriet, who glowered at them from the porch. Startled, Allison glanced back at Harriet. "Is you her mama?" Trash, thought Harriet, face burning. She was rather enjoying Allison's stuttering denial when all of a sudden Randy exaggerated his lewd little hula dance in an effort to wrench the attention back to himself. "Man stole Diddy's car off," he said. "Man from the Baptist church." He giggled, sidestepping his sister's swipe, and seemed about to elaborate when unexpectedly Ida Rue charged from the house, screen door slamming behind her, and ran toward the children, clapping her hands as if they were birds taking seed from a field. "You all go on and get out of here," she cried. "Scat." In a blink they were gone, baby and all. Ida Rue stood on the sidewalk, shaking her fist. "Don't you all be messing around here no more," she shouted after them. "I call the police on you." "Ida," wailed Allison. "Don't you Ida me." "But they were just little. They weren't bothering anything." "No, and they ain't going to bother anything either," said Ida Rue, gazing after them steadily for a minute, then dusting her hands off and heading towards the house. Ferdinand the Bull lay askew on the sidewalk where the children had dropped it. She stooped laboriously to pick it up, grasping it by the corner between thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. Holding it out at arm's length, she straightened up with a sharp exhalation and started around the house to the garbage can. "But Ida," said Allison, "that's a library book." "I don't care where it come from," said Ida Rue, without turning around. "It's filthy. I don't want you all touching it." Charlotte, her face anxious and blurry with sleep, poked her head out the front door. "What's the matter?" she said. "It was just some little kids, Mother. They weren't hurting anybody." "Oh, dear," said Charlotte, wrapping the ribbons of her bed jacket tighter at her waist. "That's too bad. I've been meaning to go in your bedroom and get up a bag of your old toys for the next time they came by." "Mother," shrieked Harriet. "Now you know you don't play with these old baby things anymore," said her mother serenely. "But they're mine. I want them. Harriet's toy farm, the dance arena, and Chrissy dolls, which she had not wanted, but asked for anyway, because the other girls in her class had them. The mouse firmly dressed in periwigs and fancy French costume, which Harriet had seen in the window of a very, very expensive shop in New Orleans. and which she had pleaded for, cried for, grew silent, and refused her supper for until finally Libby and Adelaide and Tat slipped out of the Pontchartrain Hotel and chipped in together to buy them for her. The Christmas of the mice, the happiest of Harriet's life. Never had she been so flabbergasted with joy as when she'd opened that beautiful red box. Storms of tissue paper flying. How could Harriet's mother hoard every scrap of newsprint which came into the house, get cross if Ida threw a shred of it away, and yet try to give Harriet's mice away to filthy little strangers? For this was exactly what happened. Last October, the mouse family had vanished from the top of Harriet's bureau. After a hysterical search, not historical, Harriet unearthed them in the attic, jumbled in a box with some of her other toys. Her mother, when confronted, admitted taking a few things that she thought Harriet no longer played with to give to underprivileged children, but she seemed not to realize how much Harriet loved the mice, or that she should have asked before taking them. I know your aunts gave them to you, but didn't Adelaide or one of them give you that dancerina doll? You don't want that. Harriet doubted that her mother even remembered the incident, a suspicion now confirmed by her uncomprehending stare. Don't you understand? Cried Harriet in despair. I want my toys. Don't be selfish, darling, but they're mine. I can't believe you begrudge those poor little children a few things that you're too old to play with, Charlotte said, blinking in confusion. If you'd seen how happy they were to get Robin's toys. Robin's dead. If you give them kids anything, said Ida Rude darkly, reappearing around the side of the house, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, it be nasty or broken before they get it home. After Ida Rue left for the day, Allison picked Ferdinand the bowl out of the garbage can and carried it back to the porch. In the twilight, she examined it. It had fallen in a pile of coffee grounds, and a brown stain warped the edge of the pages. She cleaned it as best she could with a paper towel, then took a $10 bill from her jewelry box and tucked it inside the front cover. $10, she thought, should more than cover the damage. When Mrs. Fawcett saw the condition the book was in, she would make them pay for it, or else give up their library privileges, and there was no way little kids like that would be able to scrape up the fine on their own. She sat on the steps, chin in hands. If Weenie hadn't died, he'd be purring beside her, her ears flattened against his skull, and his tail curled like a hook around her bare ankle. His eyes slitted across the dark lawn at the restless, echo-ranging world of night creatures that was invisible to her. Snail trails and cobwebs, glassy winged flies, beetles and field mice, and all the little wordless things, struggling in squeaks or chirps or silence. Their small world, she felt, was her true home, the secret dark of speechlessness and frantic heartbeats. Fast, ragged clouds blew across the full moon. The black gum tree tingled in the breeze, the undersides of its leaves ruffling pale in the darkness. Allison remembered almost nothing from the days after Robin died, but one strange thing she did remember was climbing up the tree as high as she could and jumping from it again and again. The fall usually knocked the air out of her. As soon as the shock jangled away, she dusted herself off and climbed up and jumped again. Thud. Over and over. She had a dream where she did the same thing, except in the dream, she didn't hit the ground. Instead, a warm wind caught her up from the grass and swept her up into the air, and she was flying, bare toes brushing the treetops. Falling fast from the sky, like a swallow skimming the lawn for 20 feet or so, and then up again, twirling and soaring into air and giddy space. But she was little then. She hadn't understood the difference. All right, we lose this. She hadn't understood the difference between dreams and life, and this was why she'd kept jumping from the tree. If she jumped enough times, she hoped maybe the warm wind from her dream would gust beneath her and lift her up into the sky. But of course that never happened. Poised on the high branch, she'd hear Ida Rue's wail from the porch. See Ida running towards her, panic-stricken, and Allison would smile and step off anyways, with Ida's despairing scream shivering delicious in the pit of her stomach as she fell. She'd jumped so many times she'd broken down the arches in her feet. It was a wonder she hadn't broken her neck. All right, that little thing's off. The night air was warm, and the moth-pale gardenia blossoms by the porch had a rich, warm, boozy smell. Allison yawned. How could you ever be perfectly sure when you were dreaming and when you were awake? In dreams, you thought you were awake, though you weren't. And though it seemed to Allison that she was currently awake, sitting barefoot on her front porch with a coffee-stained library book on the steps beside her, that didn't mean she wasn't upstairs in bed, dreaming it all. Porch, gardenias, everything. Repeatedly, during the day, as she drifted around her own house, or through the chilly, antiseptic-smelling halls of her high school, with her books in her arms, she asked herself, am I awake or asleep? How did I get here? Often, when startled all of a sudden to find herself, say, in biology class, insects on pins, red-haired Mr. Peel going on about the interphase of cell division, she could tell if she was dreaming or not by following back the spool of memory. How did I get here? She would think, dazed. What had she eaten for breakfast? Had Edie driven her to school? Was there a progression of events which had brought her somehow to these dark paneled walls, this morning classroom? Or had she been somewhere else a moment before? Or a lonely dirt road in her own yard with a yellow sky and a white thing like a sheet billowing out against it? She would think about it hard and then decide that she wasn't dreaming, because the wall clock said 9:15. Which was when her biology class met, and because she was still seated in alphabetical order with Maggie Dalton in front and Richard Eccles behind, and because the styrofoam board with the pinned insects was still hung on the rear wall, powdery Luna moth in the center between a poster of the feline skeleton and another of the central nervous system. Yet sometimes at home, mostly, Allison was disturbed to notice tiny flaws and snags in the thread of reality, for which there was no logical explanation. The roses were the wrong color and not white. Red, not white, pardon. The clothesline wasn't where it was supposed to be, but where it was before the storm blew it down 5 years ago. The switch of a lamp ever so slightly different, or in the wrong place. In family photographs or family paintings, mysterious background figures that she'd never noticed before. Frightening reflections in a parlor mirror behind the sweet family scene, a hand waving from an open window. Why, no, her mother or Ida would say when Allison pointed out these things. Don't be ridiculous. It's always been that way. I can't turn the page for some reason. What way? She didn't know. Sleeping or waking, the world was a slippery game. Fluid, stage sets, drift and echo, reflected light, and all of it sifting like salt between her numbed fingers. Pemberton Hull was driving home from the country club in his baby blue 62 open-top Cadillac. The chassis needed realigning, the radiator leaked, and it was hell to find parts. He had to send off to some warehouse in Texas and wait 2 weeks before they arrived, but still the car was his darling, his baby, his one true love, and every cent he made at the country club went either to putting gas in it or fixing it when it broke down. And when he swung around the corner of George Street, his headlights swung over little Allison Dufresne, sitting out on her front steps all by herself. He pulled out in front of her house. How old was she? 15, 17? Jailbait probably, but he had an ardent weakness for limp, spaced-out girls with thin arms and their hair falling in their eyes. Hey, he said to her. She didn't look startled, only raised her head so dreamily and vaporously that the back of his neck tingled. Waiting for somebody? No, just waiting. Caramba, thought Pem. I'm going to the drive-in, he said. You want to come? He was expecting her to say no, or I can, or let me ask my mother, but instead she brushed the bronze hair out of her eyes with the jingle of her charm bracelet and said, a beat too late. He liked this about her, her lagging, drowsy dissonance. Why? Why what? She only shrugged. She only shrugged. There you go. You said it. Pem was intrigued. There was an offness to Allison. He didn't know how else to describe it. She dragged her feet when she walked, and her hair was different from the other girls, and her clothes were slightly wrong, like the flowery dress she had on, something an old lady would wear. Yet there was a hazy, floaty air about her clumsiness that drove him crazy. Fragmentary romantic scenarios, car, radio, riverbank began to present themselves. Come on, he said. I'll have you back by 10. Harriet was lying eating a slice of pound cake and writing in her notebook when a car revved swankily outside her open window. She looked out just in time to catch a glimpse of her sister, hair in the wind, speeding away with Pemberton in his open-top car. Kneeling on the window seat, her head stuck out between the yellow organdy curtains and the yellow taste of pound cake dry in her mouth, Harriet blinked down the street. She was dumbfounded. Allison never went anywhere except down the block to one of the aunts' houses, or maybe to the grocery store. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Harriet felt a small pinch of jealousy. What on earth could they have to say to each other? Pemberton could not possibly be interested in someone like Allison. As she stared down at the illumined porch wing, Ferdinand the Bull lying on the top step, she heard a rustle in the azaleas that edged the yard. Then, to her surprise, a shape emerged, and she saw LeSharon Odom creeping quietly onto the lawn. It did not occur to Harriet that she was sneaking back for the book. Something about the cringing set of LeSharon's shoulders maddened her. Without thinking, she hurled what was of the pound cake out the window. LeSharon cried out. Then there was an abrupt disturbance in the bushes behind her. Then, a few moments later, a shadow darted clear of Harriet's lawn and skittered down the middle of the well-lit street, followed at a good distance by a smaller one, which stumbled, unable to run so fast. Harriet, kneeling on the window seat with head out between the curtains, stared for some moments at the sparkling stretch of empty pavement where the little Odoms had vanished. But the night was as still as glass. Not a leaf stirred, not a cat cried. The moon shone in a puddle on the sidewalk. Even the tinkly wind chimes on Mrs. Fountain's porch were silent. Bored and irritated, she abandoned her post. She became absorbed in her notebook again and had almost forgotten that she was supposed to be waiting up for Allison, and annoyed when a car door slammed in front. She slipped back to the window and stealthily drew the curtain. Allison, standing in the street by the driver's side of the Cadillac, toyed vaguely with her charm bracelet and said something indistinct. Pemberton barked with laughter. His hair glowed Cinderella yellow in the street lamps, so long that when it fell in his face, with just the sharp little tip of his nose poking out, he looked like a girl. Don't you believe it, darling, he said. Darling? What was that supposed to mean? Harriet let the curtains fall and shoved the notebook under the bed as Allison started around the back of the car towards the house, her bare knees red in the Cadillac's lurid taillights. The front door shut. Pem's car roared away. Allison padded up the stairs, still barefoot. She'd gone riding without her shoes on and drifted into the bedroom. Without acknowledging Harriet, she walked straight to the bureau mirror and stared gravely at her face, her nose only inches from the glass. Then she sat down on the side of her bed and carefully dusted off the bits of gravel stuck to the yellow soles of her feet. Where were you? Said Harriet. Allison, elbowing her dress over her head, made an ambiguous noise. I saw you drive off. Where did you go? She asked when her sister did not respond to this. I don't know. You don't know where you went? Said Harriet, staring hard at Allison, who kept glancing distractedly at her reflection in the glass as she stepped into her white pajama trousers. Did you have a good time? Allison, carefully avoiding Harriet's eyes, buttoned up her pajama top and got in bed. It began to pack her stuffed animals around her. They had to be arranged in a certain way about her body before she could go to sleep. Then she pulled the covers over her head. Allison. Yes, came the muffled answer after a moment or two. Do you remember what we talked about? No, I do. About writing down your dreams. When there was no answer, Harriet said in a louder voice, I put a sheet of paper by your bed and a pencil. Did you see them? No. I want you to look. Look, Allison. Allison poked her head out from under the covers just enough to see a sheet of paper turned from a spiral notebook with her bedside lamp. At the top of it was written in Harriet's hand dreams, Allison Dufresne, June 12th. Thank you, Harriet, she said, blurrily, and before Harriet could get out another word, she pulled the covers up and flounced over with her face to the wall. Harriet, after gazing steadily for some moments at her sister's back, reached under the bed and retrieved the notebook. Earlier in the day, she'd taken notes on the account in the local paper, much of which was news to her. The discovery of the body, the efforts at resuscitation. Edie apparently had cut him down from the tree with the hedge clippers and worked on his lifeless body until the ambulance came. Her mother's collapse and hospitalization, the sheriff's comments, no leads, frustrating. In the weeks that followed, she'd also written down everything she could remember that Pem had said, important or not, and the more she'd written, the more came back to her, all sorts of random little scraps she'd picked up here and there over the years, that Robin died only a few weeks before school let out for summer vacation, that it had rained that day, that there had been small burglaries in the neighborhood around that time, tools stolen from people's sheds. Related? Then that when Robin's body was found in the yard, evening services were just letting out at the Baptist church, and that one of the first people to stop and assist was old Dr. Adair, a retired pediatrician in his 80s who'd happened to be driving past with his family on the way home, that her father had been at his hunting camp, and that the preacher had to get in his car and drive down there to find him and break the news. Even if I don't find out who killed him, she thought, at least I'll find out how it happened. She also had the name of her first suspect. The very act of writing it down made her realize how easy it would be to forget, how important it would be from now on to put everything down on paper. Suddenly, a thought struck her. Where did he live? She hopped out of bed and went down to the telephone table in the front hall. When she came to his name in the book, Danny Ratliff, a spidery little chill ran down her back. There was no proper address, only Route 260. Harriet, after gnawing her lip in indecision, dialed the number and inhaled with sharp surprise. When it was caught up on the first ring, ugly television clatter in the background, a man barked "Yellow!" with a crash as if slamming the lid on a devil. Harriet banged down the receiver with both hands. I saw my brother trying to kiss your sister last night, said Healy to Harriet as they sat on Edie's back steps. Healy had come over to fetch her after breakfast. Where? By the river. I was fishing. Healy was always trudging down to the river with his cane pole and his sorrowful bucket of worms. Nobody ever came with him. Nobody ever wanted the little bream and crappies he caught either, so he almost always let them go. Sitting alone in the dark, he loved night fishing the best, with the frogs chirruping, and a wide white ribbon of moonlight bobbing on the water. His favorite daydream was that he and Harriet lived by themselves like grown-ups in a little shack down by the river. The idea entertained him for hours. Dirty faces and leaves in their hair, building campfires, catching frogs and mud turtles. Harriet's eyes, ferocious when they glowed at him suddenly in the dark, like a little feral cat's. He shivered. I wish you'd come last night, he said. I saw an owl. What was Allison doing? Said Harriet in disbelief. Not fishing. Nope. See, he said confidentially. Scooting closer on his rear end, I heard Pem's car on the bank. You know, that noise it makes. Expertly, with pursed lips, he imitated it. Whap, 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 whap. You can hear him coming a mile off, so I know it's him. And I thought Mama had sent him to get me. So I got my stuff and climbed up, but he wasn't looking for me. Healy laughed, a short, knowing huff of a laugh that came out something so very sophisticated that he repeated it, even more satisfyingly, a beat or two later. What's so funny? Well, he could not resist the opening she'd given him for yet a third chance to try out the sophisticated new laugh. There was Allison, way on her side of the car, but Pem had his arm on the seat, and he was leaning towards her. He extended an arm behind Harriet's shoulders to demonstrate. Like this. He made a big, wet, smacking noise, and Harriet irritably shifted away. Did she kiss him back? She didn't look like she cared one way or another. I'd sneaked way up on them, he said brightly. I started to throw a night crawler in the car, but Pem would have beat the shit out of me. He offered Harriet a boiled peanut from his pocket, which she refused. What's the matter? It's not poison. I don't like peanuts. Good, more for me, he said, popping the peanut into his own mouth. Come on, go fishing with me today. No thanks. I found a sandbar hidden in the reeds. There's a path that goes right down to it. You'll love this place. It's white sand like Florida. No, Harriet's father often took the same irritating tone, assuring her with confidence that she would love this or that thing. Football, square dance music, church, cookouts. She knew full well she detested. What's your problem, Harriet? It grieved Healy that she never did what he wanted to do. He wanted to walk through the narrow path in the tall grass with her, holding hands and smoking cigarettes like grown people, their bare legs all scratched and muddy, fine rain and a fine white froth blown up around the edge of the reeds.